Hello, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be with you today. Big thanks to Nicole Kenley, who should be with you right now. So today, what I want to do is think about how we can analyze poetry within the context of the history of slavery. And so today, we're looking at two poems that are from sort of the end of the late 18th century. And so, in order to do that, I want to give you the brief, very, very brief history of slavery, and then go on to talk about what analysis is, and then give us some terms so that we can start to break down these poems. Um, so, in the rest of this section on poetry, we're going to be looking at the specific historical context for each of the poems we're reading. But just for today, I want to give you sort of a broad sense of what's going on leading up to this moment where Phillis Wheatley and William Blake are writing these poems on slavery. So, with the European exploration and colonization of the Americas in the 16th century, there was an increased demand for laborers in the New World, and Europeans perceived Africans as fit to work in the American conditions, to do the labor that was required there. There was a steady increase of slaves moved from Africa to America from the 17th century to the 18th century. So in the 17th century, there were about 5,000 slaves moved from Africa to America each year. By the end of the 18th century, so I'm talking here about when Blake and Wheatley are writing, in the 1770s, 1790s. So in the late 18th century, there were about 100,000 Africans moved from Africa to America to feed the demand for laborers. In the late 18th century, there was also an emerging and growing anti-slavery movement in both Great Britain and America. In 1807, in both Great Britain and the U.S., the slave trade was made illegal. Still, slavery was not yet abolished. Great Britain did pass an abolition act for slavery in 1833. So that made any form of slavery illegal in any of the British territories. On the other hand, the United States would not abolish slavery until the American Civil War, and we'll go over that in more detail when we talk about Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. So hopefully that just sort of gives you a very sort of vague sense of that history. Now let me give you just a little bit of background on Phillis Wheatley and William Blake. Phillis Wheatley was brought to America from Africa when she was 8 years old. Her owners in America, in the American colonies, taught her how to read and write, and she was eventually freed. Her poems were published both before and after the American Revolution. The poem that we're reading today on being brought to America from Africa was written before the American Revolution. Her authorship was questioned once her poems were published. A number of I guess so-called intellectual figures in Boston, Massachusetts, didn't believe that a slave could, or a former slave could write poetry, and they put her on trial. They did decide, I guess, that she was indeed the author, and their verdict was included in her next volume of poetry. William Blake was an English, British poet, well known for his revolutionary politics. He supported the American Revolution and the French Revolution. He was very critical of the Anglican Church, yet he was also deeply interested in spiritual experiences. Some would even say mystical experiences. William Blake was also well known for his development of what is called relief etching. It's a particular way of producing a printed text. And what it involves is using pens and brushes um, to write out his poems on a copper plate. And then once he had established the poem on the plate, he would use acid to make the copper fall sort of into the background and bring the words of his poem into the foreground. So that's why it's called a relief. He was putting the words in relief, and he would use those copper plates to put his text on the page, and then he would use watercolors in order to make the images, such as the ones that you saw online in reading his poem, The Little Black Boy. And so what I want us to think about for your work today on the worksheet, I want us to think about how these poems by Wheatley and Blake are representing racial relationships in the transatlantic world. How do the texts more generally that we're reading in this class support or resist racial hierarchies? Right. So this leads us now to what is analysis. Analysis is, we can define it as breaking down, at least for for the terms of this class, breaking down a text into its parts, and then asking ourselves what those parts mean in relation to other parts, as well as in relation to the whole. And we do this sort of analysis on a daily basis. We also use this technique of analysis in our other fields of study, whether that's chemistry or biology or the social sciences. It is a method where we're breaking things down into their parts and asking what they mean. So you can also think about this in terms of looking for patterns and contrasts. What patterns do I see in this text? What sort of contrasts or differences do I see in this text? And then once we establish that we've noticed a pattern or a contrast, we want to ask the question, what does that mean? What does that tell me? And for our purposes in this first part of the class, what does that tell me about what this text is doing, let's say, with racial representations? Or what is this text doing in response to the problem of slavery in the 18th century? So to break that down sort of even more simply, we can just say analysis is can be phrased in terms of two questions. What do I notice in a text, and what does it mean? What do I notice, and what does it mean? All right. So now I'd like to give you something very specific to notice in both Wheatley's and Blake's poems.